January 17, 1915. Silvertown, East London. The Thames lay dark and cold beneath a low winter sky, its waters reflecting the silhouettes of factory chimneys that had for a century defined Britain's industrial might. Along the waterfront, men in wool coats hurried through streets still slick with morning frost, their breath visible in the frigid air. Inside the Brunner Mond chemical works, the acrid smell of ammonia hung heavy, mixing with coal smoke and the peculiar, unsettling odour that no worker could quite describe. Sharp, organic, faintly sweet. It was the smell of desperation being transformed into salvation. In great vats and copper vessels, human urine was being chemically dismantled, its molecular secrets extracted, purified and weaponized. By week's end, this factory and others like it across Britain would produce over 2,000 tons of trinitrotoluene, TNT, from the most abundant and overlooked resource a nation at war could possess, the waste of its own people. 6 months earlier, such a scene would have been unimaginable. Britain, the world's foremost industrial power, the nation whose navy ruled the waves, and whose factories had clothed and armed half the globe, found itself in a position so absurd it seemed almost theatrical. The British Empire was running out of explosives. Not low on explosives, not rationing explosives carefully, actually genuinely, catastrophically running out. The shells fired by British artillery batteries in France were being counted, rationed like precious jewels. Ammunition dumps that should have held millions of rounds contained thousands. Factory managers received telegrams from the War Office with orders so urgent they bordered on panic. And in Whitehall, men in positions of great authority confronted a reality that threatened to undo everything. Britain might lose the war not because of cowardice, not because of tactical failure, but because it could not produce enough explosive to fill its shells. The problem was nitrogen, specifically fixed nitrogen. Nitrogen chemically bound into compounds that could be used for both fertilizers and explosives. For decades, Britain had relied on a single source, sodium nitrate imported from the Atacama Desert in Chile, transported across 2 oceans by merchant ships that were now being hunted by German submarines. Before the war, this arrangement seemed perfectly sensible. The Chilean nitrate fields were vast, the shipping lanes secure, and Britain's industrial appetite well fed. But in August 1914, when the lights went out across Europe, the mathematics of war revealed themselves with brutal clarity. A single day of artillery bombardment on the Western Front consumed more explosives than entire 19th century campaigns. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915 would expend more shells in 35 minutes than the entire Boer War had consumed in 3 years. And every one of those shells required nitrates that were now sailing across submarine-infested waters, in ships that were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. By January 1915, Britain's strategic reserve of Chilean nitrate had dwindled to a 6-week supply. 6 weeks. After that, the artillery would fall silent, the shells would sit empty in their casings, and the British Expeditionary Force in France would face German machine guns and artillery with nothing but rifles and hope. What the generals and politicians expected was a miracle of empire, some colonial resource, some overlooked deposit, some diplomatic arrangement that would restore the flow of nitrates and allow the war to continue along familiar lines. What they received instead was a miracle of chemistry, born from the mind of a German Jewish scientist whose process Britain had ignored before the war, and implemented through an industrial transformation so complete and so desperate that it would forever change how nations thought about resources, waste, and the relationship between civilian life and military power. The Haber-Bosch process, developed in Germany before the war, had solved the nitrogen problem by pulling it directly from the air. Nitrogen gas, which comprises 78% of the atmosphere, could be combined with hydrogen under extreme pressure and temperature to produce ammonia. From ammonia came nitric acid, From nitric acid came TNT, cordite, and every other nitrogen-based explosive the modern military required. Germany, cut off from Chilean nitrates by the British naval blockade, had pivoted to synthetic nitrogen production with remarkable speed. By 1915, German factories were producing fixed nitrogen from thin air, turning atmospheric gas into artillery shells through industrial alchemy. The British had watched this development before the war with mild interest and no sense of urgency. After all, Britain controlled the seas. Britain controlled Chile. Britain had no need for complicated German chemistry when simple shipping would suffice. Now that assumption lay exposed as perhaps the greatest strategic miscalculation of the industrial age. Germany was synthesizing nitrogen from nothing. Britain was running out. The response, when it came, was characteristically British, pragmatic, slightly absurd, and executed with a determination that bordered on mania. If Britain could not yet build Haber-Bosch plants, the technology was German, patented, and required industrial expertise Britain did not possess in sufficient quantity, then Britain would extract nitrogen from every available source using every available method. And the most available source, the most abundant nitrogen-containing compound in any industrialized nation, was urea, human urea, which meant urine. The collection began quietly, almost shamefully, in the industrial cities of the north. Factory managers received discreet instructions. Public lavatories in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool were retrofitted with collection systems. Workers were informed, with varying degrees of directness, that their bodily waste was now a matter of national security. The language used was carefully vague. Nitrogen recovery, chemical salvage, patriotic contribution to the war effort. But everyone understood. Chamber pots across Britain were being emptied not into sewers, but into collection barrels. Public urinals were plumbed to divert their contents into tank cars. Even the great country estates, those symbols of aristocratic permanence, found their waste no longer flowing into ornamental drains, but being carted away to chemical works that operated around the clock. At Brunner Mond, the process was both elegant and grotesque. Urine arrived in tank cars and barrels, thousands of gallons per day, the contribution of a nation at war with itself as much as with Germany. The liquid was first filtered to remove solid contaminants, a task assigned to men who received extra pay and asked no questions. Then it entered evaporation chambers, where heat concentrated the urea into crystalline form. These crystals were dissolved in sulfuric acid, which broke the urea molecules apart, releasing ammonia gas. The ammonia was captured, purified, and combined with oxygen and water to produce nitric acid. The nitric acid was then used to nitrate toluene, a coal tar derivative, creating trinitrotoluene, TNT. Each step was dangerous. Each step produced toxic fumes and corrosive byproducts. And each step was performed by workers who understood that their labour, degrading as it might seem, was keeping British guns firing. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Britain, the empire upon which the sun never set, was now fighting its war with piss. German propagandists would later make much of this, producing cartoons showing British soldiers filling shells from chamber pots. But the British workers who processed urine into explosives understood something the propagandists did not. This was not humiliation. This was totalization. This was the industrial nation-state, discovering that in modern war there was no such thing as waste, no such thing as civilians, no boundary between the home front and the battlefront. Every body, every function, every molecule became part of the war machine. By March 1915, Brunner Mond and associated chemical works were producing over 2,000 tons of TNT per week, much of it from urine-derived ammonia. The shells that fell on German positions during the Second Battle of Ypres contained nitrogen that had, weeks earlier, been inside British workers. The ammunition that supported the Battle of Loos came from the same source. It was a closed loop of industrial metabolism. Food eaten by workers in Manchester became urea, became ammonia, became TNT, became explosions that killed German soldiers in Flanders. The circle of production and destruction had tightened until it included the most intimate functions of human biology. But the urine program was always understood as temporary, a stopgap measure while Britain built its own synthetic nitrogen industry. The government had finally grasped what the Germans had understood before the war. Whoever controlled nitrogen production controlled modern warfare. In 1915, Britain began constructing Haber-Bosch plants under license, a humiliating necessity that required paying royalties to German patent holders, even while trying to kill German soldiers. The first British synthetic ammonia plant opened in 1916, a massive facility in Billingham that would eventually dwarf anything Germany had built. By 1917, Britain was producing fixed nitrogen from air on an industrial scale that exceeded even German capacity. The urine collection program was quietly phased out, its contribution to the war effort recorded in classified documents that would not be fully disclosed for decades. The workers at Silvertown who had processed urine into explosives were reassigned or simply released without ceremony. The collection systems in public lavatories were dismantled or left to rust. The tank cars that had hauled human waste to chemical factories were scrubbed, repainted, and returned to conventional service. It was as if the entire episode had been a fever dream, a moment of national desperation so extreme that it could not be acknowledged in polite company. Veterans of the program rarely spoke of their work. When they did, it was with a dark humor that concealed deeper truths about what the war had revealed. That industrial civilization could digest anything, transform anything, weaponize anything. That the boundary between sacred and profane, between human and material, between life and death, was thinner than anyone had imagined. The German soldiers who died from British shells in 1915 never knew the source of the explosives that killed them. They expected to face an enemy weakened by shortages, an empire overstretched and undersupplied. What they experienced instead was a nation that had reorganized its entire metabolic cycle around the production of death. The shells that landed in their trenches came from coal tar and human waste, from air and water, from resources so ordinary and so abundant that no military planner had thought to target them. Germany had invented synthetic nitrogen, but Britain had discovered something more fundamental, that a truly industrialized nation could not be starved of resources because the nation itself was a resource. Every breath, every meal, every biological function could be captured, processed, and weaponized. This realization would outlive the war. In 1918, when the armistice came, Britain's chemical industry had been transformed from a collection of dye works and fertilizer plants into an integrated system capable of producing millions of tons of fixed nitrogen per year. That capacity would feed Britain in peace and arm it in the next war. The Haber-Bosch plants, built in desperation during World War I, would run continuously for decades, their product shifting between fertilizers and explosives as geopolitical winds changed. The men who built them understood that they had created something permanent, an industrial base that made Britain nearly immune to blockade. Never again would Britain face a nitrogen shortage. Never again would the British military depend on shipping lanes for its explosives. The Empire had internalized the means of destruction, but it was the urine program, that desperate expedient of 1915, that revealed the true nature of industrial total war. In previous conflicts, armies fought with resources accumulated before battle. Swords and spears were forged in peacetime, gunpowder was stockpiled. Even in the Napoleonic Wars, the production of weapons remained separate from the rhythm of daily life. But modern war demanded something different, the continuous, real-time transformation of civilian existence into military capacity. There could be no reserves because consumption had become so vast. There could be no stockpiles because technology evolved too rapidly. Everything had to flow continuously, from mine to factory to battlefield, a logistical bloodstream that pumped material from the home front to the front itself without pause. The British worker who urinated into a collection barrel in 1915 was not preparing for war. He was waging war. His body had become a munitions factory, producing raw materials that would, through a chain of industrial processes, become lethal force. This was not metaphor. This was literal truth. And it represented a transformation in the relationship between citizen and state more profound than any political revolution. The liberal democracy, which had always maintained some boundary between public and private, between state power and individual sovereignty, discovered that modern war recognized no such boundaries. Total war meant total mobilization, meant total integration of all resources, including those that resided within human bodies. The Germans, who had pioneered synthetic nitrogen, understood this. Their own people had been mobilized with similar completeness, but they had expected their industrial lead to provide a decisive advantage. They had expected Britain, dependent on colonial resources and global shipping, to gradually weaken as the war stretched on. What they had not expected was Britain's capacity to adapt, to improvise, to reorganize its industrial base with a speed that matched Germany's own. The Haber-Bosch process was German, but the willingness to extract nitrogen from human waste, to operate chemical plants at scales that exceeded all previous industrial experience, to transform an entire nation into a weapons factory, that was universal. That was what industrial civilization could do when fully mobilized. By 1918, Britain was producing more fixed nitrogen than Germany. British shells were more plentiful, often more reliable, sometimes more powerful. The ammunition crisis of 1915 seemed like ancient history, but those who remembered the urine collection program carried with them a knowledge that shaped their understanding of what had happened. They had seen with their own eyes the machinery of modern war strip away every pretense, every civilizational nicety, every distinction between high and low, clean and filthy, sacred and mundane. They had seen chemistry reduce human beings to nitrogen sources, had seen industry organize bodily functions into production chains, had seen the nation-state claim ownership of molecular processes that occurred inside individual bodies. This knowledge was disturbing, not because it was barbaric. War had always been barbaric, but because it was rational. The urine collection program made perfect sense. It was efficient, effective, and entirely in keeping with the logic of industrial chemistry. No one could argue it was unnecessary. No one could claim it was excessive. It was simply what had to be done when a nation's survival depended on producing thousands of tons of explosives per week, and the conventional supply chains had broken down. It was, in that sense, the perfect symbol of 20th century warfare, degrading, necessary, rational, and total. The TNT that flowed from Brunner Mond and similar facilities did more than fill shells. It filled a psychological void, a crisis of confidence that had gripped British leadership in late 1914 and early 1915. The realization that Britain might lose the war for lack of explosives had called into question every assumption about empire, industry, and power. If the world's greatest industrial nation could be brought to its knees by a shortage of Chilean bird droppings, then what did industrial supremacy actually mean? But the nitrogen crisis, precisely because it was so acute and so terrifying, forced Britain to discover capacities it did not know it possessed. The rapid construction of synthetic nitrogen plants, the willingness to extract resources from sources previously considered beneath consideration, the ability to reorganize entire industries in months rather than years, all of this revealed a resilience that Britain's leaders had hoped existed but never tested. Germany, watching British ammunition expenditure climb month after month despite the submarine blockade, understood it had miscalculated. The Haber-Bosch process had given Germany a temporary advantage, But Britain's willingness to adopt and exceed German methods meant that advantage was fleeting. By 1916, the industrial contest between Britain and Germany had become a race to see who could more completely mobilize their economy, more thoroughly exploit their resources, more efficiently convert civilian capacity into military power. It was a race both nations would win and lose. They would both achieve industrial mobilization so complete that it blurred every distinction between war and peace, between soldier and civilian, between battlefront and home front. And they would both discover that such mobilization, once begun, could not be easily reversed. The workers who processed urine into TNT did not think in these grand terms. They thought about their wages, about the health risks of working with ammonia and nitric acid, about the strange pride that came from doing work no one else would do. They understood they were part of something important, something unprecedented. They had been told, repeatedly, that their work was saving British lives, that every ton of TNT they produced meant another German attack repelled, another British position held. Whether they believed this completely is unknowable, but they continued working, day after day, in factories that smelled of death being synthesized from life, in conditions that left their skin stained yellow from picric acid exposure, in heat and noise and chemical fumes that damaged lungs and eyes and nerves. Their contribution would not be honored with monuments or memorial days. The urine collection program was not the sort of thing nations celebrated after victory. But it was, perhaps, more representative of what modern war actually required than any cavalry charge or naval battle. It was unglamorous, industrial, democratic in the worst sense. Everyone contributed. Everyone was reduced to a source of raw materials. Everyone became part of a system that operated according to chemical rather than human logic. In the decades after the war, as historians compiled their accounts of battles and strategies, the nitrogen crisis of 1915 appeared as a footnote, a brief logistical difficulty that was quickly resolved. The urine collection program merited a sentence, maybe two, usually phrased with the sort of dry humor that suggested it was too absurd to take seriously. But for those who lived through it, who understood how close Britain had come to military collapse, the episode carried a different weight. It was proof that modern war had escaped human control, that the industrial systems created to wage war would consume anything, use anything, transform anything into explosives and death. The copper vats at Brunner Mond, where urine was processed into ammonia, were eventually dismantled, sold for scrap, melted down and reformed into peacetime products. The men who operated them moved on to other jobs, carried the chemical stains on their hands until those faded too, and died eventually with their contribution to the war effort largely unrecorded. But the knowledge embedded in that process, the knowledge that a nation at war could extract resources from sources no one had imagined, could reorganize its industrial base overnight, could break down the barriers between bodies and weapons, that knowledge remained. It informed Britain's preparation for the Second World War, when industrial mobilization began years before the first shot was fired. It informed British strategic thinking about resources, about supply chains, about the relationship between civilian industry and military capacity. And it informed, in subtle ways, the British understanding of what it meant to be a modern power. Not a nation with a large army or a powerful navy, but a nation with the industrial capacity to transform itself completely in response to strategic necessity. A nation that could, if required, weaponize anything. The last barrels of urine-derived TNT were fired sometime in late 1916, their provenance unknown to the artillerymen who loaded them into guns. By then, synthetic nitrogen from Harbour Bosch plants had taken over completely. The shells looked identical, performed identically, killed identically. No one could tell the difference between TNT made from air and TNT made from urine. At the molecular level, they were the same substance. And perhaps that was the deepest truth the nitrogen crisis revealed. that modern chemistry had erased the meaningful difference between noble and base, between pure and impure, between acceptable and unacceptable sources of power. Everything was molecules. Everything could be rearranged. Everything was, potentially, explosive. The soldiers in the trenches who benefited from the urine-derived TNT never knew of its existence. They experienced only the result: shells in abundance, ammunition that allowed British artillery to fire at rates the Germans could not match, explosive power that slowly, incrementally, pushed the front line eastward. They credited British industrial might, and they were correct. They credited the Royal Navy for keeping supply lines open, and they were partly correct. But they did not know, could not know, that for a crucial period in 1915 and 1916, the shells that covered their advances and protected their positions came from the most ordinary and intimate products of human biology, transformed through industrial alchemy into the most destructive substances human beings had yet created. This was the lesson Britain learned in 1915, the lesson that would define its approach to warfare for the rest of the century. That victory in industrial war went not to the nation with the most resources, but to the nation most willing to discover resources in unexpected places. That adaptability mattered more than initial advantage. That the willingness to reorganize, to improvise, to break taboos and precedents and conventional thinking, that willingness was itself a form of power more decisive than battleships or armies. Germany had invented synthetic nitrogen, but Britain had invented something more important: a systematic approach to total mobilization that recognized no boundary, respected no convention, and stopped at nothing to feed the machinery of war. In January 1915, Britain had 0 explosives, or as close to 0 as made no difference. 6 months later, Britain was producing TNT at rates that exceeded anything achieved before the war. The transformation was chemical, industrial, and philosophical. It required rethinking what resources were, where they came from, and what a nation could demand of its citizens. It required accepting that modern war had become something qualitatively different from historical warfare, not a contest between armies, but a contest between industrial systems, between entire populations organized for material production and destruction. The urine flowed into collection barrels, into tank cars, into copper vats at Silvertown and Oldbury, and a dozen other chemical works across Britain. It was heated, filtered, chemically decomposed, purified, and transformed. And what emerged was not just TNT, not just explosive, but proof that the industrial nation-state had achieved a form of power that transcended traditional military force. It had achieved the power to metabolize itself, to turn its own waste into weapons, to close the circle between consumption and destruction so completely that they became aspects of the same process. This was the power that would define the 20th century, not the power to destroy, which was ancient, but the power to sustain destruction indefinitely by drawing on resources that could never be exhausted because they were continuously regenerated by the civilian population itself. And so the shells flew, thousands per day, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. They flew east toward German lines, and they carried with them the molecular residue of human biology, transformed into explosive chemistry. They represented a kind of industrial metabolism that had no precedent in history, a fusion of the biological and the mechanical so complete that the boundaries between them ceased to exist. The men who fired them thought they were firing steel and TNT and copper, but they were firing something more fundamental. They were firing the industrial nation-state's capacity to reorganize itself around the singular purpose of victory, to discover resources where none seemed to exist, to transform the most ordinary products of life into instruments of death with an efficiency that would have seemed like magic to any previous generation. Britain had 0 explosives in January 1915. By December, Britain had millions of tons of explosives, and the capacity to produce millions more. The nation that had nearly lost the war for lack of Chilean birdshit had discovered it could pull nitrogen from the air and from human bodies, could organize chemistry and industry and population into a system that generated destructive power faster than it could be consumed. This was not victory, not yet, but it was survival. And in the arithmetic of total war, survival meant the enemy would eventually be exhausted. Germany's industrial capacity was finite. Britain's, it turned out, was limited only by imagination and the willingness to discard old categories about what could and could not be weaponized. The Thames still flows past Silvertown, darker now, poisoned by a century of industrial use. The factories are gone, torn down or converted to other purposes. But somewhere in the molecular structure of modern Britain, in the nitrogen content of the soil, and the strategic thinking of military planners, and the institutional memory of chemical companies, the legacy remains. The knowledge that when pushed to the edge, when facing extinction, a modern nation can reorganize itself completely in months. That it can find resources in places no one thought to look. That it can turn waste into weapons, biology into chemistry, desperation into systematic industrial process. That there is, in the end, no such thing as an inert civilian population, only a population that has not yet been fully mobilized. This knowledge is neither comforting nor inspiring. It simply is, a truth about industrial modernity that the nitrogen crisis of 1915 revealed with a clarity that could never be forgotten by those who understood what had really happened when Britain turned urine into TNT at 2,100 tons per week, and in doing so, discovered what total war actually meant.